I do bring greetings on behalf of United Lutheran Seminary, one school on two campuses, campi, I'm not sure how you say that, campuses, Gettysburg and Philadelphia. We are at a historic time in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm not sure how familiar you are with these numbers, but currently we have 600 empty pulpits in congregations that are large enough and can sustain a full-time pastor and cannot find one because we have not been graduating them from seminary at the rate needed to replace those who are retiring. So 600 is our current number, and most alarmingly, that number is to grow to 1,000 by the year 2020. So we are trying very diligently to encourage more students to consider the vocation of ordained ministry because our church needs them badly. So if you have felt the tug at your heart of God calling you into the ordained ministry, don't let age, gender, ethnicity, anything else stand in your way. We need you. God is calling for you. We recently started a program at United Lutheran Seminary where every full-time qualified student has full tuition covered. We are very serious about encouraging people and making sure that money and debt is not an encumbrance to their calling to come to seminary. So keep that in mind, and thank you to those of you who support the seminary, because it is only through your prayers and through your contributions that we can offer this full tuition initiative. That's the end of my little advertisement. There you go. Now we get the sermon. Presbyterian minister Adam McHugh writes, "All the lectures and sermons that we hear, all the books that we read, all the instruction and advice we receive do not compare to the transformative power of being heard." This quote tells us two things. First, those of us who spend our lives earnestly preaching in order to transform lives should remember that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in proportion. And secondly, listening transforms lives, the lives of others and our own. The first public parable of Jesus that we read this morning, the first time he told a parable in front of crowds of people, the parable of the sower, or alternatively, the parable of the listeners. Notice how the parable begins. Listen. And how the parable ends. Let anyone with ears listen. This is the story of listeners. And who are these listeners? Again, to quote McHugh, there are the path hearers. Those are the ones who don't really hear at all. They're deflecting and dismissing Jesus' words. There are the rocky hearers who let the word penetrate a little bit, but then reject it because of adverse voices of struggle and persecution. Then there are the thorny hearers who listen a little while longer, they lean in a bit more, but slowly they allow the subtle power of seductive voices, the accumulation of wealth, and the sparkle of material things to suffocate the word. And finally come the true and faithful listeners, those who receive the word deep into themselves, where the word does its proper work, flowering and bearing fruit. Listening is so essential that the very first parable Jesus tells focuses on it. How do we hear the word? In the parables and throughout the Gospels, Jesus gives many commands. We hear them. We know the Bible tells us, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet. But the commandment to listen that Jesus gives is first, and it's frequent. In the Bible, there are over 1,500 times when the words listen appear. Listen, hear. The most frequently voiced complaint in the Bible is that people aren't listening. And Jesus is a leader who doesn't simply talk the talk, telling us to listen so he can expound. On the contrary, Jesus is an excellent listener. Throughout the scriptures, we repeatedly see how Jesus takes the time and becomes still enough to listen. Jesus asks questions and listens carefully to the answers, even when he may already know what they are. Jesus does not hesitate to sit at the table and share a meal and an ear with all sorts of shady characters. Jesus draws people out with intense, engaged, transformative listening. Even and especially those people who are radically, culturally different. Women, children, tax collectors. And sometimes, just through the process of being truly valued and listened to and heard, people are changed. Can we imagine what would happen in this town, or any town, I suppose, if instead of preparing the next big speech, big press release, email, Facebook post, or tweet, everyone who is usually talking took a deep breath and a long listen? If we opted out of path listening, rocky and thorny listening, and turned to true and fruitful listening? We talk and we use our words to gain power. That's what we do as humans. Powerful people get to surround themselves with supporters who nod when they speak. Powerful people don't need to listen. Powerful people get to talk. But Jesus is in the business of giving power away. That's what it means to be a crucified king. Powerful people get to speak. Jesus people learn to listen. Listening well gives power away. Jesus is an upside-down leader, and he calls us to be upside-down followers, to turn off our own voices and agendas for a few minutes and turn on our ears. And in so doing, we just might begin to heal the world and to hear words that guide and change our hearts. I'm reminded of a story and a time in my life. It was April of 1999. Think back, almost 20 years. I was pregnant with my first son, just weeks away from giving birth. And then the news came. 2 boys, 2 sons of other mothers, had wrought terrible destruction at a high school called Columbine. 15 dead, 24 wounded, the children, the sons and daughters of other parents. As I waited for my son to be born into this world, I wondered what had caused such tragedy. The blame was shifted from one cause to another, and then there was an unforgettable quote. And it came from an unexpected source, shock rocker Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson was asked what, if anything, he would have said to these boys to keep them from committing such an atrocious act. They were listening to Manson's music, and so Manson was implicated in this crime. Society wanted to know, Marilyn Manson, if you could say something to them to stop them, what would you say? And Manson responded, I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would have listened to what they have to say, because that's what no one did. Listening matters. Listening to each other and listening to God. And are these two acts mutually exclusive? Listening to each other and listening to God? Well, faithful Christians, incoming and outgoing students at the seminary are quick to exclaim, I'm always trying to hear the voice of God, but I just can't hear it, no matter how hard I listen. Maybe you've felt this way. This has always been a common complaint. Even as we sit in quiet rooms, light candles, walk labyrinths, and meditate at silent retreats. Perhaps if we aren't hearing the voice of God, we should start by listening to the voice of our neighbor. The kid down the street, the elderly couple next door. There have been countless times in my life when I have prayerfully sought insight into a perplexing situation, praying for an answer, and the divine answer arrived through the voice of a flesh and blood person. Sometimes, in fact, usually, not even my favorite person. And always, I wanted to wave away the person who was so intently talking at me, I don't have time to listen. I'm waiting for the voice of God. The voice of God sometimes sounds like a toddler calling us, Mama, put down your cell phone and lay on the green grass and look at the blue sky with me. The voice of God sometimes sounds like a spouse, complaining loudly, angrily, yelling at us that we just don't understand them, reminding us to refocus on relationships because that's what really matters. And sometimes the voice of God sounds like a member of the opposite political party, cynical and self-righteous, inadvertently recalling for us that in the midst of deep division, we are still all the beloved children of the same God. Perhaps the situation isn't that God is quiet or absent. Instead, God is everywhere and speaking constantly. Listen to the heart of the neighbor whom God has commanded us to love as ourselves. And perhaps we will hear the mighty, thundering, barely whispering, ever-present voice of God. To return to the parable of the sower, will we be path hearers, rocky listeners, thorny listeners, or true and faithful listeners? With the same kind of intensity that happens when we suspect someone in the next row or the next room is gossiping about us. Of course, the honest answer is all of the above. We are path listeners, rocky listeners, thorny listeners, and faithful and true listeners at different times in our lives. But for today, let us strive to be true listeners. Excessive, extravagant, generous listeners in every aspect of our lives, with every person with which we come into contact. Let anyone with ears listen. Amen.